Hi, and welcome to the second lesson in our series on the book of Acts. I'm Ron Bergeron, and I'm grateful that you've given me a chance to work through this book with you. As I've studied this book and as I've looked through it, it's impressed me that the story of Acts is really our story as Christians who have tried to emulate what the first century church did. To understand Acts is to understand our very essence and our roots. And I hope that you'll take the opportunity as we go through this book over the next several months to make it part of your story as well. The book neatly breaks into three sections, if you will. When Luke has Jesus tell the apostles in the very first paragraph of his book that they are going to be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth, Luke is really giving an outline for what the book is going to be about. And we're going to see how the gospel, starting in Jerusalem, moves in an ever-widening circle to Judea and Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. Now, for the first couple of weeks of our study, we'll still be in Jerusalem. This section ends in what we call chapter 7. But remember, there were no chapters or verse markings or anything when it was written. And remember also that this was meant to be read aloud and passed through the churches. Which brings up an interesting idea I want to ask you to consider. In order to make this study come alive, so that it's not just another reading of the book of Acts that you've heard for so many years, try to do something different with it. Try to find maybe a new version of the Bible that you've never read before to make it sound different in your ears. There are lots of apps that you can listen to the Bible on your phone or in your car as you're going to work or as you're doing the laundry, as you're doing chores around the house. There are lots of little places where you can find a way to get the Word into your life in this way. I encourage you to do that. Maybe use it in your devotionals. Use your own creativity to find ways to make this work a part of you. If we understand the history of Acts and where the church began and where it ended up 30 years later, then we'll have a good handle on what the essence of the gospel is and how people in churches work together. Now, the problems that they face were different than the ones we face, but human nature doesn't change, even though the issues might. This is the only book in the entire Bible that gives us a narrative history of the period of time from 2 months after Jesus' death or thereabouts through 30 years later to just before the destruction of Jerusalem. It's the only one. We have other letters written by people during this time period, but this is the only historical narrative we have of that period. So it's vitally important that we get a good handle on it. So I'm looking forward to the study, and I hope you'll join me as we dig right in Lesson 2. One of the ways that I found it helpful to conceptualize this was to think in terms of what questions Luke might have been attempting to answer for Theophilus as he wrote his story. Questions that Theophilus and maybe others generally would have asked about what this all means. Like, how did this new religion turn from a Jewish religion into what it is now? Or as they traveled around the Roman Empire and found that this new Christianity was spreading, they might wonder, how did it get out here so quickly? Within 33 years, it's almost just everywhere. They might also wonder what the old guard, what the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem thought about this. Were they accepting of this new religion? Were they opposed to it? Or another element that I think is important to Acts, it seems to be important to Luke to emphasize it, is the continued work of Jesus, even though he is physically gone. How is Jesus still with them? So already we have seen the Holy Spirit as it has filled these common fishermen and regular working people to inspired levels of new insight and wisdom as they tell the crowds of all these Jews gathered in Jerusalem from all over the area about this new life. And thus the church begins. So we pick up the story now in chapter 3 with Peter's second sermon. After healing a man of lameness in the temple, Peter and John preached the second sermon to the people, and in it they give the living Jesus credit for the healing and use the revelation of Jesus' power in the present tense as an explanation. So they're clearly continuing the healing work that Jesus had been so well known for while he was alive. Note now, this is the first specific mention of a miracle in the book of Acts since Jesus' ascension. The first being the arrival of the Holy Spirit, and another non-specific reference to signs and wonders done by the apostles in chapter 2. And as a side note, miracles will play a large part in the book of Acts. And in fact, it's the last book in the New Testament to so prominently use the theme of miracles in its storyline. So at the close of chapter 2, it closes with the testimony that everyone kept feeling a sense of awe. Many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles, and all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all, as anyone might have need. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number daily those who were being saved. Think about the picture that Luke is painting there. It's one of unity. If you look at the words he uses to describe that fellowship at that time, that they were together, they had all things in common, they were sharing them with all, they were of one mind, taking their meals together, you really get a picture of something that you might consider a realized promise from the Old Testament, a little slice of heaven right there on earth. The church in its infancy, as it appears here, very completely and innocently fulfills all the laws and directives of the Old Testament. By living together in unity and honesty and in amazement, they basically are showing us the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham all those years ago when he promised to reunite himself with his people by giving them of his own Holy Spirit in order to unite them. They themselves were the new temple, the temple made up of lots of little people temples and not a gigantic stone temple, as Jesus had promised when he prophesied. Back in Mark chapter 14 and verse 58, his accusers said, "We've heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands.'" And this is that temple that Jesus had promised. And so this new temple arises with this new group of what is already now several thousand followers, and it flourishes and spreads the news among all the Jerusalem Jews, and all is well with the world. It says, having favor with all the people, they continued being together. And everything was okay for a little while. But beginning in the next segment of this Jerusalem chapter, Luke is going to show us the first opposition to this group, this sect, which are not yet called Christians. We don't know exactly how much time has passed, but we have a clue from the end of chapter 2 that probably the time elapsed between Pentecost and the second sermon could be measured in days or weeks, because it references that they got together day by day to gather together. The next event recorded by Luke is the imprisonment of Peter and John. The first instance of the stone temple, if you will, attempting to silence the new living temple. And after making their defense before the high priest, the rulers, elders, and scribes, Peter, who only a month or two earlier had denied even knowing Jesus, in the same place as he stood now, boldly defies his master's murderers. And when told to be silent about this Jesus that they claimed to be the Messiah, prophesied for thousands of years through the Old Testament, Peter said, "Whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to men, you be the judge. For we cannot stop speaking. about what we have seen and heard. Notice that they claim to be eyewitnesses of the things that they are witnessing before the people. And we all love this next section because it says, when they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, they were amazed and began to realize them as having been with Jesus. I want us to stop there for a moment, and I want to put a few questions here on the screen. You can pause the screen and talk about these questions amongst yourselves. Let's summarize quickly what we have seen so far as we wrap this lesson up today. We've seen the formation and the explosive growth of a radical new religious group based on the belief in a resurrected Christ. It starts in Jerusalem, just as Jesus predicted, before it expands to the uttermost parts of the earth. The explosive growth gathered 3,000 converts on its very first day of existence. That number more than doubled in a matter of days to include 5,000 men, not mentioning women and children. Then the scriptures say that, quote, multitudes of men and women were converted. And by the time we get to chapter 6, we'll learn that even the priests from inside the opposition are turning to this new living temple. The picture that Luke paints here is one of an exciting, vibrant movement, a spiritual revolution unlike anything the Jewish nation had ever seen, with the living Christ at its center. We've also seen how Luke sets up the contrast between the old stone church in Jerusalem, where the keepers of the Judaic law sit in judgment, and the living church of Christ's body, where Christ alone sits at the head as its prophet, priest, and king. A contrast that Luke will shortly accentuate in the next section of our story. But for now, this happy multitude is still in Jerusalem, living and worshiping together as a contented spiritual family. But soon they will be dispersed, and the story will continue beyond the borders of the Jewish world and into Judea, Samaria, and the far reaches of the globe. The miracles that the apostles perform, all in the service of verifying their authenticity as Jesus' messengers, will continue throughout the story. But nowhere are they more prominently featured than here in the beginning of the story, when the apostles' credibility was not yet established. And Jesus, though absent in body, is ever present through the Holy Spirit that he sent to teach and instruct his new church. Read on ahead, have a great week, and I'll see you next time.